talking with God about kings and kingdoms. We are in 1 Kings chapter 5, 6, and 7. The title of this week's talk is A House with a Name. Come on in, let's check it out.
All the bubbas of the world, we got one mission in mind.
Welcome to the Biblical channel. Always glad somebody is showing up. The Word of God is where it's at, brother. And in the Word of God, we move ourselves from the bullshit to the holy shit so that we can know our shit and shoot the shit with others so that we actually, represent God and actually get the most out of life that we can. That's our goal here at the Biblical channel. We're just a bunch of rednecks. We're just a bunch of hillbillies. Bubbas of the world is kind of our motto and our theme here. But as average bubbas of the world, you are the spotlight of God. You are just the kind of people that God is after. Doesn't matter color of your skin, doesn't matter origin of your country, doesn't matter about anything other than you. And you need to know God's story, and that's the way the Bible rolls. And you and I can be literal geniuses by just, getting a good handle on the Bible, and that's what we are here to do, is just talk about the Word of God as it comes to us. We're just walking through the book of 1 Kings because it is the third in a series of 4 books that were put together at about the same time. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, all kind of functions as a volume titled or recognized or spoken about as Kings and Kingdoms. So we are now in chapter 5, 6, and 7. Now, I guess we ought to have a news flash commercial break or just a postscript kind of statement, and that is most of the material, 85% of the material that we have in these 3 chapters is very dry reading, a lot about cubits, a lot about all the building of the temple. So previously, Solomon has been clearly recognized that he is in God's favor. Solomon has, thrown his love to the Lord, and that is exactly where God wanted him. And he asks for the right thing with wisdom for others as he tries to manage this kingdom. So Solomon is off to a great start. We remember the promise that God had made to Solomon's father David, that indeed one of David's sons would build a temple or a place, a house for the name of the Lord. It wouldn't be David because he had blood on his hands and his life was way too complicated. Solomon is the peacetime king, and because Solomon is the peacetime king, he will be on task or tasked with the building of God's temple. Also, got to keep in mind, God told David, don't forget, I was happy in my tenting with my people. God's whole point and God's whole purpose is to be with his people. And in the midst of his people, this whole business of temples and buildings and houses is something that we get confused about. So God comes into it with a little bit of hesitation. But it's okay because it will serve God's purpose in the long run. But if God hesitates on it, you can guarantee that we are going to screw it up. And that's a story for later. But for now, it is King Solomon who sets out with the task of building the temple. Now, the last place we left off with was that Solomon's wisdom is now attracting the peacetime affairs of the nations around. And when you get to chapter 5, it opens up with now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when they heard that, they had anointed him king in place of his father. Hiram always loved David. So Hiram comes, right to the doorstep of Solomon, says, man, I want to be in your action, brother. And Solomon says, we are going to put you into the heart of the action because we're going to build this house for the Lord, the temple. Hiram says, I'm in. I've got all these cedars up here. And so you get this, very, very detailed, origin of the temple and, all of the materials and the details of the construction of it. So if you're a bit of a geek, I guess this text is for you But here's the news flash, and here's the that we need to put across the screen, and that is God himself is the one who is orchestrating this story, and God himself is putting his story in place in the times of 3,000 years ago and prior to that. So God is very contemporary with the times. And while this might be boring reading for us, and we might even roll our eyes and say, what is up with all these cubits? I don't even know what a cubit is. It's 18 inches, by the way. But suffice it to say that it's going to be hard for any of us to really relate to this text, so it seems, except that, remember that this is a very important kind of writing, because at the time of Solomon building this temple, there were already cultures around that had written down very specific building plans in their logs or in their histories. As human beings start to become a writing culture, one of the most common writings that we do actually find in archaeology are these detailed descriptions of building projects, and maybe we would call them, government projects that, were taken on. And it was almost, kind of a symbol of pride that we're able to do these things. And so here is the description of the thing that we did and how we did it, all of that. And so this, what we call boring material, is actually set up for the audience of the time to know that they too are involved in something that the nations are doing. Remember, Israel thinks it's important to have a king like other nations. God says, whoa, pump the brakes on that because I'm your king, but hey, I'll let you make this mistake and kind of learn this lesson. Israel also wants a temple like the other nations, and if they're going to build something like this, then they're going to record it like this. And so this writing, or this section of writing, actually fits in quite perfectly, just in the style of writing that matches up with other nations. And remember, the Bible is a big history. It is writing in a historical manner. It's not writing in a fantastical manner. It's not writing in the genre of fantasy. The Bible is a huge epic, and other nations and countries also have a huge epic. But the epics that the other nations have fit into the category of fantastical. We might call them myth today. I hesitate on that because I think myths are important, but if you only think of myths as fake, then that's not helpful. So let's just think in terms of epic. Epics are important. Big giant stories are important to the cultures around, and the cultures around have their own big giant epics that they have written down. And they also have their recorded log of their activity in building, especially big important structures. And so this material fits in both. God is putting together his big epic, his epic about himself involving himself in a tiny nation, an obscure nation, a backwater nation, and making them into something. But he's going to do so in a way that is entirely congruent with what is going on in the times. This may not be congruent with our times, but it ought to be very impressive to us that this material fits with the times that it sits in 3,000 years ago. Also, the construction process and the construction goals, the size of the building and everything about these buildings that Solomon is going to build, it also fits in with the relative size and scope of the work that was going on around and in the times, and the way that it was done too. So what is very important in God's big epic for us is that he dumps in there a heavy dose of historical reality to us to make it clear that his big epic is not like any other big epic. Every other big epic is pure fantasy. We have Marmaduke, and how Marmaduke, goes to battle with some god and slays this god in a bizarre way, and then takes the body or the corpse of this god and makes the heavens and the earth out of it. That is not the way. I recommend you go back and look at our Genesis series. That is not the way Genesis works. That nowhere even close. This material here, it may seem dry to us, but there is a story going on too. There's some very interesting parts of this story. That's what we're going to dive in and get at. We're not going to read it all, but Hiram the king, good guy, good friend of the empire. He's an outsider, and so we also see that the desire of God and his wisdom is to be attractive to all of the nations so that they might come in and be a part of what Israel's doing, to be a part of Israel's God, to be in the same relationship that Israel is in with God. And that's always God's desire. So we roll down. Solomon says that he intends on building a house with a name, a house for the name of the Lord. So it reminds me of that old, what is that song? Anyhow, I was riding through the desert on a horse with no name. Well, here we go. Here we are in the Middle Eastern, we'll call it the high desert. And there's a house with a name being built. And this whole house motif is also, the big motif of what's going on. God is building a house. And when he's building a house, yeah, sure, we're going to look at the physical construction of a real life place. But we're also thinking in terms of concept. A house, think in terms of Games of Thrones. A house with a name is a house with a family name. And God is also building a house with a name, his own name. But a house with a name is about people. And that is the main overriding point. So Solomon says, I intend to build a house with a name, and so it goes. And all this detail about all the work that is done, Solomon gave to Hiram, and the Lord gave Solomon wisdom, just as he had promised him, and there was peace between him and Hiram. We are told, down in chapter 5, verse 11 and 12. And then in verse 13, we get an interesting, kind of ripple here, especially for our modern ears, and that is King Solomon drafted a forced labor force of the number of 10,000 or 30,000 men. 10,000 of them would work for a month, and then another 10,000 would work for a month, and another 10,000 would work for a month, meaning that you were forced into labor. But this isn't necessarily the slavery that we think about. This is ancient slavery, and also Solomon is very smart in doing so. In fact, Solomon drafting forced labor is part of his wisdom. We think, oh my gosh, you shouldn't do that. No. Remember, Israel's the people who want these things. They want a king, they want a temple, they want the things that the other nations seem to have. And God says, okay, we'll do that, but we're going to define it all differently. We're going to do it differently, but we'll give you the things that you're looking for. So in order to have these things, you're going to have to participate. And so, this drafting of Israel is I think it's more akin to, maybe a military draft, and maybe you disagree with that too. But you got to note the kindness involved here, that this is working 1 month on, 2 months off, 1 month on, 2 months off. And we would hope that it's temporary to get the job done, and then we can move on and everybody goes back home. Okay, so still not the kind of slavery that, should ruffle the hair on the back of our necks. Right. So God's wisdom is still at the center of this, and Solomon drafting a labor force, even though it's forced labor, is part of the wisdom. And, everybody's got to chip in and do their part. And so that's what's going on. So anyhow, that's that. The other thing that just catches my eye, because I'm a huge fan of Mike Rowe's Dirty Jobs, always have been. My kids have been in love with that show. I love work. I love good work. I'm a man that works with my hands as well. And it just amazes me that, this stone can be hewed out of mountains 3,000 years ago, and even beyond that, before that, but it's just amazing for me to think of the labor, the skilled labor, the craftsman, the artisanship, bad word. Anyhow, you get the drift that goes on in the construction of these ancient buildings. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's absolutely interesting to just think of what it takes and the amount of labor to go chisel, perfectly sized blocks and slates and, table, and wow, it's amazing. Well, anyhow, that's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 rolls into narrative, meaning that now it's time to take a pause and do some story time. Because this isn't just about building temples. This is about the big story. This is about the big story and getting an update on the big story. Chapter 6 starts off with, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So once again, just some concrete reality and dates, building this picture that you're not reading a fantasy, you're reading reality, but you're also reading a reality that connects itself with 480 years ago. 480 years ago, God brought the people of Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob out of Israel. 400 years before that, God had made a promise to Abraham. So what the narrator is doing is saying, this isn't just a temple story. This is a redemption story. This is a promise and fulfillment story. This is not just a temple story. The temple has a role in this story, but the bigger story is that of redemption. When God ended the slavery that Israel had gotten into, when he ended their bondage and he gave them the gift of freedom, the freedom to be in a relationship with the real God who made the world. Okay, so that was 480 years ago. A lot of time has gone by, and now they are in a sweet place. And what they are officially celebrating, really, by this temple building, is that they have officially ended their time of wandering. We remember that it took an unnecessary amount of time for Israel to even enter into the promised land because they had to wander for 40 years. But really, Israel has been adrift for 480 years. It has been a long time. And so this is actually a big celebration of them ending their time of wandering and entering into this time of peace where Solomon is now king. The wars are now over, so to speak. And peace is extended to all the nations around. And as the temple is being built, the gift of rest, which is a biblical theme that started in the book of Genesis, that God's big idea for his creation, especially human beings, was to enter into his rest. But because we think we know the difference between good and evil on our own without God, we, as human beings, did not enter that state of rest. Entering rest with God is always the goal. And so this temple being built is also symbolic of a great period of time where peace with the neighbors, peace with Israel, peace from wandering around is now reality. And this is a good moment. So it is God who has ended their bondage and brought them the gift of freedom. It is God who has ended their wandering and brought them the gift of rest. Will the people of Israel be able to keep this going? That's what we hope, and that's what we're longing for. So that's what the author is doing, is reminding us that this story is a redemption story. Then God speaks to Solomon in verse 11 and says, concerning this house, okay, say Solomon, concerning this house that you're going to build me, listen up. If you walk in my statutes and obey my rules and keep all my commandments and walk in them, I will establish my word with you, my covenant with you, which I spoke to David your father and to Abraham their father, and Moses, and I will tabernacle, I will tent, I will live amongst the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. God intervenes to make it very clear to Solomon that this temple is not to be misunderstood. This temple is to be understood as God reaching into people's lives for the sake of dwelling in their lives. But if the people have no interest in obeying God's statutes, then this will all go away. The temple will go away. The land will go away. yada, yada, yada. That is the story. And so that's the tension in the story. Will they be able to just simply obey God's commands? Sounds easy. It is easy. Do they do it? I think you know the answer, but we won't dwell on that. Chapter 6 rolls on with incredible detail of blah, 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 temple building. Don't expect you to be interesting. Chapter 6 ends with an interesting note. It took 7 years to build the temple. Chapter 7, as we have it, begins by saying Solomon built his own house, and his own house took 13 years. And his own house is quite bigger than the temple. Is that a problem? I don't know. It's interesting though, right? It's more of that narrative tension. It's part of the epic story. When you read that, it took 7 years to build a temple 60 by 20, and it took 13 years to build a palace 100 by 50, it makes you wonder, like, oh, is Solomon going to lose the plot? I'm not sure, that we can just dive in and say yes at this point, although we know the end of the story, that he will. However, it's just part of that tension, like, oh, and then we get more tension because his own house where he dwelt in the other court back hall was like the same workmanship as the temple. And Solomon also made a house like his for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken up in marriage. Well, that's interesting. Solomon gets a house twice the size as the temple. His wife from Pharaoh's daughter also gets a house double the size of the temple. It just makes us wonder what's going on here. That's interesting. And is this kind of the beginning of, well, something bad? Maybe, maybe not. In of itself, it's not bad. And it makes good sense that the palace would be, bigger than the temple. The temple has its function, it only needs to be so big. Anyhow, we'll just hold that in tension. I think, though, that the big message that takes place here comes in the rest of chapter 7. In the finishing of the temple, there are 2 pillars that Solomon builds, and these 2 pillars say it all. The two pillars' name are Talkin and Boaz. And if you ever joined the Masons, or if you joined the Masons and the Shriners, the name Boaz and Talkin. Okay, well, that's biblical. These are the 2 pillars of Solomon's temple. They're made of bronze, yada yada. That's not important, but it's the name Boaz and Talkin. The name Boaz means that he will establish, meaning God. God will establish. And the name Talkin, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Talkin means he will establish. Boaz means in him is strength. Both of them are referring to God. So you have these 2 pillars of God as Boaz and Talkin, which if we just understood those 2 words, we would hear God will establish and God is our strength. That's the name of this temple. So you get that picture, that it's really not about a stone building. It's about a personal relationship of God that God establishes. And what he establishes is way more important than what we establish. And that he is our strength, not ourselves as our strength. Again, that's the picture that God wants to settle into the people's lives, in Solomon's lives, that this is a temple, but it's still about obeying me. It's still about being in love with me. Like Solomon had declared, I'm in love with God and all of his statutes. Well, God said, that is the heart and soul of this, getting people back into relationship with me, a relationship of understanding. The temple itself is then explained to be layered with gold, and it seems very gaudy, but let's remember that it's God that we're talking about here. So all of this gaudiness, is quite fitting, that we would, make something very pretty when it comes to God. So it's not a problem. And it's very understandable that you would have nice things in the service of God. And it also is a reminder that God is not against nice things. We can all have nice things. God is not against our nice things, but our nice things are like flashy little shiny objects, and we, like fish, start chasing, little flashy objects, and we get caught. We get caught up in them. So We aren't made to be cavemen. We aren't made to be troglodytes who, never advance. And that's another thing. Like, I get the impression from too many people of one side of our political bent that would have us, be cavemen or something like that, that they seem, I don't know. That's think about that for a second though. Whether it's God right here accepting the lavishness of this temple as perfectly acceptable, and even Solomon's temple or palace, and the palaces and people themselves are allowed to have opulence in their lives, they're allowed to have nice things. We're not meant to be cavemen. We are meant to grow. We are meant to have nice things. It's okay, but don't let them become a distraction and think that that's what life is all about. Okay, now Chapter 7 just ends with lots of details, and let's now take a big look. And how does this fit into the big story? Well, to see how it fits in with the big story, we have to fast forward to Jesus. And remember the famous episode, which The Chosen has just put together, where Jesus comes into the temple and he basically says, you know what? This place ain't going too well. It's not going like my father had intended. Nobody gets it. And if you destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll rebuild it. If you destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Okay, this ruffles everybody's feathers. What does Jesus mean? Well, Jesus ends up being crucified for threatening to destroy the temple. Does this also sound like the kind of ridiculous political, entertainment that's going on these days? That the same people that say that they are the most loving people are seemingly willing to kill you if you don't hold their position. Anyhow, Jesus is going to be killed for threatening to destroy the temple. A stone temple, mind you, the second, not even the first, okay, how is he going to do that? He's not going to do that. But Jesus' point is, you've missed the point of the temple. That was God's warning. Don't miss the point of the temple. And the point of the temple is for God to dwell amongst his people. And so when Jesus says he's going to build this temple in 3 days, we know now what he means. He's going to rise from the dead in 3 days. And the temple of God is none other than himself. You see, Jesus still has Solomon's temple in mind. But what Solomon has, or what Jesus has in mind, is the ideas that God had given to the people of Israel and Solomon about the temple. And that is that the most important thing is to establish ourselves in relationship with God, where he is the establisher and he is the one that makes things happen, and that he is our strength and that he is our source. Jesus does not spare the language of, if you love me, you will obey me. It is the same idea here that God is telling Solomon, if you love me like you say you do, then you will obey me. If the people of Israel love me, then they will obey me. Jesus is talking about the same thing, and he is going to let the temple go because he himself is the temple. He is the temple. Ladies and gentlemen, Jesus Christ is the temple of God. He is the house with a name. The house with a name is Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is building that kind of a house that holds people that take on the name of Jesus Christ. And so, yes, he is the name of the house of God. He is the Redeemer bringing us to freedom. He is the one who will bring us rest. Remember how Jesus said, I am Lord of the Sabbath. I am the Lord of rest. If you want rest, come to me. If you come to me, I will establish you, and it will be my strength that you can see in my rising from the dead that will establish you. The house with a name, my friends, Jesus Christ. And this passage here is rocketing towards Jesus, and we'll get there eventually in hundreds of years. But for now, catch you next time.